Thank you for joining us today. My name is Trey Calvin. I'm the Communications Director for the Center for Applied Linguistics. And today you've tuned in to Research to Policy, Critical Conversations in Language Education. This is our fifth installment of this series. It's been going on all year. Today we have some very special guests to speak with you today from the Center for Applied Linguistics. At this point, I'm just here for technical support, so I will zoom out and I will throw it over to Maribel. Thank you so much for hosting us today. I'm really looking forward to this discussion.
Thank you, Trey. As Trey mentioned, my name is Maribel Marrero Colon, and I am the Professional Development Content Manager for the Center for Applied Linguistics. And I have the honor of emceeing today's very brief but wonderful conversation. I'm joined by two esteemed experts in the field who together account for nearly 60 years of experience at the intersection of, research, policy, and practice and language education. We're very lucky to have so much knowledge here to share with you and, our entire audience who's very much interested in the well-being of our language learners. Now, one of the things that we'd like to ask you, if you have any questions for our esteemed speakers, please put them in the Q&A box. Any comments you want to make in the chat are welcome, but questions will not be taken from the chat box. The chat box button is at the bottom of your screen at any time to share your thoughts and your comments. So if you want to start now by saying hello to everybody, that would be really great. But please remember that questions will be taken only from the Q&A box. Also, we want to ask that before we begin, make sure to mute your microphones to avoid any interruptions during the presentation. And we also have a great addition to our presentation to view closed captioning, which we now have in progress. I just put some information in the chat box about that. So to view closed captioning during a Zoom webinar, you just have to click the closed caption button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and just put down show subtitles. So when you click on that, you will be able to see closed captioning. I got to tell you, it's pretty quick. I was playing with it before, and when Trey was speaking, it was zooming along. Now, I'd like to take a moment and introduce to you our panelists. We have Dr. Alfredo Altiles, who's a professor in the Graduate School of Education at Stanford University. His interdisciplinary scholarship examines educational opportunities and inequities related to disability intersections with race, language, gender, and social class. Dr. Altiles' scholarship has brought attention to the intersection of historical, spatial, and cultural influences in the production of racial and linguistic disparities in special education across school districts, across cities, states, and nations. Thank you so much for joining us today to share your thoughts, Alfredo. I also would like to introduce Susana Cordova. Susana has worked in K-12 education for over 30 years. A Denver native, she recently joined the Dallas ISD as Deputy Superintendent for Leading and Learning, where she oversees school leadership, academic programming, and innovation strategies. It's such a pleasure to have you with us today, Susana.
Thank you. Very, very excited to be here.
As everyone knows, our topic today is digital equity for students with disabilities. And I would like to pose a few questions to both of our speakers. This is really exciting for me because I'm an adult with a learning disability and I was never picked up during school. So it's really interesting to take a look at this from a different point of view. So I'm going to start with our first question, and either one of you can start, you can jump in. And the first question for today is, can you talk about the challenges that a student with learning disabilities faces when learning language in a digital environment? Also, can you speak to the challenges that language educators face when teaching students with disabilities online? So we're looking at what are the challenges the students face and what are the challenges that our educators face?
Sure. So I can jump in really quickly and share some of the challenges that we encountered both at the start of the pandemic, and then as time went on, as we saw our schools frequently have students who were virtual all year. Many of our students, in fact, who remained in virtual instruction were our English learners. But right at the very outset, there were huge barriers, first and foremost, to access to technology, to access to the internet. We find, I have found both in Denver and in Dallas, that the communities that are most underserved by telecom, both in terms of high-speed broadband and affordable access to the internet, tend to be our communities of color and our low-income communities. And certainly for many of our immigrant families, particularly families who speak languages other than English or Spanish, the access to the internet was very, very challenging. And even when school districts could provide families with a hotspot or with a Chromebook, we had to really think differently about what support looked like to help people understand, how do you connect a Chromebook to a Wi-Fi router? And how do we have information that was accessible for parents of first graders who may not have had any experience with getting online in the home in the first place? So there were lots of technical barriers that we needed to overcome to be able to make sure that kids just frankly had access. That's before you start talking about what quality learning looks like.
Those are indeed critical issues, Susanna. And I wanted to also make a couple of comments to set the context more broadly in terms around the topic that we're covering today. And I think there are three key points that we need to keep in mind in this discussion. One is that the pandemic has really served to deepen pre-existing inequalities. This is something that is affecting all students, especially students of color, particularly students with disabilities, and more especially students with disability that have diverse backgrounds. So this deepening of pre-existing inequality is something that we need to keep in mind. And the second thing is that when I look at the literature, I see a prevalence of attention to the negative impact. I haven't found enough research or information about some of the best practices. So I think this is something that I will encourage everyone working in school districts, especially, to share the good experiences and the good impacts that you're having so that everybody can benefit from that. And the last point to set the context for me is the alarming lack of intersectional analysis in this discussion. I find either attention to students with disabilities or attention to English language learners. And I think if we think about that intersection of English learners with disabilities, it's something that we really don't have enough information about that. And I relate to the point that Susanna made regarding the lack of infrastructure. The research is showing that the characteristics of the community, the location of the community, the situation of the district in terms of access to staffing is a major barrier in terms of how schools responded. And the second point is Susanna's item, which is the pre-existing infrastructure of the district in terms of technology and digital technologies particularly, and how those two factors combine to shape the kinds of responses we have seen around the country to address the needs, especially of those with learning disabilities. I think one of the most critical aspects also in this regard is beyond this point of structural differences is the lack of access to engage in English language conversation with adults and with peers. This is one of the most important consequences of the pandemic. The fact that these students are lacking access to these conversations that are, as we know, very enriching. The lack of receiving intensive language instruction at intervals that are fairly frequent that they will get in face-to-face is a second consequence of this. And all of those informal conversational exchanges with peers and adults that really build up the capacity in the language is a third area that is critical for us to keep in mind.
Now, those are really great points. So I think I'm going to actually piggyback on that and ask you then, over this past year in the pandemic, what are ways in which schools, families, and communities are engaging students with disabilities in effective digital experiences, and what can they do? So what are things that are being done and what can further be done in order to engage, not just the schools, but the family and the community as well.
I actually do think that there are some bright spots that come out of our experience with COVID that we need to really embrace as a new way of thinking about supporting students and their families. And certainly one of the barriers I think that we can remove is how we can engage with families, particularly around things like IEP meetings. And so you think about a low-income family where maybe both parents are working in the service industry. It can be really challenging to get time off of work. With technology now, including using cell phones, we actually can host IEP meetings virtually without parents having to take a half day off work, use public transportation to get to the school to be able to do that. We can ensure that we've got regular, ongoing, weekly meetings with parents using technology to keep parents deeply engaged in the learning that's going on. I think it's really highlighted the value of assistive technology for our students with disabilities and how we can use assistive technology. Even the things like the captioning that we're seeing here in Facebook that can do translation for our students and their families. I think there are lots of things that we need to embrace and continue to use moving forward. One of the things that it really calls on us all to do is make sure that our teachers have the time to learn how to use these resources and to think really thoughtfully about what digital learning for students with disabilities can look like in the classroom to ensure that we are maximizing, but that we're not replacing the very best of what we get from live interactions in person with qualified teachers and kids.
Absolutely. And one of the things is to make sure, to piggyback on what you're saying, is to make sure that after all of the upheaval from the pandemic, that we keep using it and don't try to go back the way we were before, where the parents were still cut off.
Right, that's right.
Alfredo, can you add something more to that?
Sure. There are interesting experiences in using home visits, building on Susanna's point that how we do IEPs, that the use of technologies and tools can change the way we do IEPs as well as the way we communicate and engage with families. The research on this has shown that particularly with immigrant students, English learners and immigrant students with and without disabilities, setting up home visits can really change not only access to opportunities for parents and kids to engage with the administration and the teachers, but also there is a related impact on the teaching force, the staff at the school, that even though may have access to the home and to life at home that might reinforce deficit views of many of these families. These home visits can become opportunities to build relationships and to begin to see those families on a different light. So I think home visits have shown some promise in terms of structuring the time and the way in which teachers connect with the families. There is some alarming data showing abuses of discipline practices for students with disabilities and students of color during the pandemic in significant way because the discipline codes are not adapted or adjusted to the current circumstances. So many districts are still applying the same discipline codes to situations during online instruction. So one of the critical needs at this point is to begin to engage the school community, the staff and the faculty to rethink what does it mean to live in this digital environment for the kinds of codes we want to be using and engage parents in that conversation. So that's another area that we need to be thinking about it. We had some interesting experience at Stanford that my colleague Elizabeth Kozlewski led, conducting listening sessions. She invited groups of parents, a large number of parents from a district in San Jose, California, and invited folks from the technology sector to put them in conversation and hear the obstacles and the barriers that families were facing in accessing technologies, as Susanna was describing. Not with the idea of how do we do better tutorials or how do we teach parents to use the existing technology, but to think about challenges and unique insights that these families could bring through their own experiences to imagine new ways of adapting the technologies for these kids. And it was a very productive conversation.
Okay, now one of our viewers brought up a really good question. Do privacy issues arise when using technology to talk to the parents or plan for meetings with students with disabilities? Are there privacy issues having information coming across the internet?
I think anytime we're using either, meetings in person or meetings with online technology, it's really important to make sure that we are doing it in a way that does maintain privacy. And so some of the best practices really are making sure that we're not publishing publicly the line for a Zoom link, for example, to be able to do it in that way. We've hosted very successful Zoom-based IEP meetings with families. We also had a comment in the chat I noticed about folks who had been previously doing home visits prior to the pandemic and wondering about what would happen. Many districts, including my previous district in Denver, as well as here in Dallas, have continued to host home visits using technology via Zoom. And it's been a very, very successful way to continue. Amy in the chat also had a really good comment about when she was teaching virtually, she was not only able to reach her students, but the extended family. And so family members were getting more engaged in learning, which can be really beneficial, I think, not just for the students, but for the extended family as well.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really important point to bring out. Now, Alfredo mentioned before IEPs. So the question is, can you provide some examples of how IEPs and 504 plans can be updated to reflect digital learning and the new accommodations needed in a digital learning environment? Because there's been a lot of literature this year about IEPs, meeting IEP goals, developing digital IEP goals. Have either of you had or seen any examples in the effective use?
I've seen data from the Office for Civil Rights denouncing lots of infractions and complaints from families and parents, articulating the problem of many IEPs and 504 plans not meeting the letter of the plan. And obviously because of the pandemic, not a small fraction of those are actually addressed and resolved over time. And I think that the key is to be thinking about flexibility and thinking about assets available in the home environment that could be incorporated into the IEPs and the 504. Maybe Susanna would like to share some specific examples that are happening in her district, but I think the opportunity to be thinking about building on assets of students to incorporate and having more flexibility in terms of the length of activities and the tasks assigned to students given the constraints of digital technologies is something that has to be considered in this conversation.
Well, and I think it's also really important to note that for many of our students, and particularly for students with disabilities, the pandemic has had a tremendous disruption on their learning. Here in Dallas, we had been on a multi-year trajectory of improvement, and we've seen that come to a screeching halt as a result of the pandemic. Our students with disabilities had many of their services dramatically interrupted, particularly at the end of the 2020 school year, March 2020 through May of 2020, and in many cases, no services were provided virtually or in person for students throughout that spring, particularly many of the services that needed to be provided with in person. And I think it does mean that we need to think very thoughtfully about the use of additional funding for compensatory services. And also to try to maximize on when we can do some of those services with remote instruction. There were very successful examples, for example, of speech that could be conducted virtually, but there are some things, OTPT, that's not going to be as effective virtually as it is in person. And we really need to think thoughtfully about how we support our students who lost ground over the last 15 months.
Particularly in the provision of related services, Susanna, many parents are complaining about that. That's one of the areas in which they're saying our kids are not getting those related services, in part because of the settings and the conditions under which those services are provided. It's very hard to do it online.
That's
And
correct.
so what I've seen is OT and physical therapy services providers recording short videos of sessions to guide a series of exercises or activities that they may share with families for a few minutes at a time. And this is especially challenging for early childhood education, as we all know, that the attention span and the amount of planning and curriculum intensity is very different in that age. But using videos, short videos, I think is a relatively affordable way of providing those related services if you enlist the specialist in creating those for the family.
I'm going to piggyback a question onto there that's a personal question of mine is, would it be more effective if we actually added goals and objectives to the IEP that are language based? Most states now just do reading and math, and teachers don't see the IEP as a living, breathing document that needs to be used every day. So if we're going to translate to the digital world, should we be actually writing goals and objectives for digital use and learning language through digital use?
I definitely think that, obviously an IEP does need to be individualized, but for our students who are both English learners and identified with disabilities, really taking into consideration how all teachers, both general ed teachers and special educators, are supporting the language development needs of students along with the learning needs or the physical needs of students with IEPs is going to be really critical. And particularly when you think about the experience that many of our English learners have had with disabilities or without disabilities in terms of their lack of access to language models if they were not in person, just makes it even more challenging. It raises the premium on making sure that we're focused on language. That's something that I've been really committed to, even for our students without disabilities, but especially for our students with disabilities.
Yeah, and we were discussing this point right before the event, Maribel, the assumption that many people make that if a student has a disability, we should not expose them to second language and bilingual education. That is a myth. We know from research that it should not prevent us, the fact that you have a disability, from using a second language. In fact, we should use it as a resource and as an asset. So I think it's definitely yes to your question that we need to be thinking about that. There is a systemic barrier here because we know that once an English learner is identified as having a disability, it is very frequent to see that a lot of the language supports are dropped for very specific institutional and financial reasons. So I think it makes an important point to have advocates within the school community to make sure that they ask the questions you ask, to continue to provide those resources for language. And remember also that many families who may not be proficient in English may also need their support now more than ever that they are at home without the support of the school, to connect socially through community organizations that might be brokered by the school, to have access to those language models that Susana was talking about. It's critical for the family and the kids to have access to these language experiences.
And if I could just build on that, one of the things that I think has really exploded is the use of tools that can be very supportive. There were a couple of questions in the chat and I think in the Q&A around like, what are some things that we can do for young children, particularly when things like captioning is not as helpful. We've just seen an explosion of resources like the use of Nearpod or the use of Seesaw, where you can post both visuals, where you can, build supportive slide decks that you can display, that archives material so that if you're teaching synchronously or asynchronously, students and their families can access that. And so I do think that there are really supportive ways that we can help our students who are learning English and who have disabilities and give them real-time 24-hour-a-day access, particularly when we make the internet available to them in their home.
Absolutely. So we're running out of time, but I really want to ask this question from each of you. If you had a magic wand, what policy changes or updates or enhancements would you make? You know, and this can be local, state, or federal level. And why would you want to implement that change? So, Susanna, I'm handing you a magic wand. What do you think?
Yeah. So definitely one of the policy recommendations that I would make is we've been incredibly blessed with funding through the ESSER 2 and ESSER 3 to help address many of the impacts of the pandemic. The change that I would recommend is we're going to need longer time to spend that funding and potentially even funding after the time period to help address the gaps that have been created. Here in Dallas, we're seeing achievement that looks like where we were 4 years ago. And I think it's going to take at least that long to help recover and gain ground for where we were.
Okay, so we're going to pass the wand over to you, Alfredo. What do you think?
Yes. And by the way, there is a very interesting resource that the Future Ed, published, titled COVID Relief Playbook. And it has a number of research-based ideas in terms of using these relief funds for changes in policies and practices. So some of them include investing in early warning systems to make sure that we detect early enough the support that certain groups of students might need. That will require a number of investment in data infrastructures in the district and the school level, which is critical. But it has been proven that by following a set of really basic indicators, it will be easy to support the work of teachers. Staffing arrangements now more than ever, because many districts don't have enough bilingual teachers and teachers with expertise in second language. They're even more stretched today, and they don't have the same level of influence they might have before. Can we think about professional development, ongoing professional development for teachers that will allow the expertise of these specialists to influence other teachers? Because there was a question in the chat about whether more English learners will be misidentified. And it is possible that many teachers, out of not having the understanding of second language issues, might rush to make decisions about kids having a disability. So thinking about staffing arrangements and professional development opportunities for the teachers to engage with these questions and to understand those issues. So that will be a second area. And I think mental health interventions, there is growing evidence that kids with and without disabilities are suffering in that mental health and wellness realm. So I think it's critical that we consider that a lot of the school discipline issues might be connected to mental health issues. And how can we begin to bring to the toolkit of teachers and administrators access to information about how to engage with mental health needs, not as a reactive force, but more in a proactive. How do we set up systems that will be getting at the issues before they get too problematic?
Okay, so Trey, I think unfortunately we're running out of time.
I'm looking at the clock. We have about maybe time for one question from the audience, maybe two if we're feeling about going over, but we are at 4:29.
Okay, so there was a question about how in the digital world are service hours monitored and prove that they're actually happening. So that's a really good question when we're talking about staffing, and how do we monitor all that? And the same goes with multilingual learners. How do we assure that their service needs are actually being met? And that goes with the interventions that all of you have discussed, because that's a big issue, making sure that, okay, yes, we've aligned this, we put it into effect, but how do we know that we're actually getting the services?
Yeah, and I think we're definitely at a place in the history of education where it's going to be so much more. Are we doing what our students need, and not are we checking the box of compliance, and are we giving the right number of hours? And so obviously it is really important that we are in compliance, but the conversations that I think are really important to have is like, how do you move from compliance, which is a prerequisite, to true commitment, which is ensuring that kids have the support that they need to be successful. And so in a digital world, just as the same as in a brick and mortar world, it is really important that we are both providing the service and we're monitoring the progress to help students actually make the gains that we think are going to be really critical for them. And so in the same way that we monitor service in buildings, we need to be doing that virtually. If it's done in a virtual or digital environment, we need expert teachers who are working with students, expert and trained teachers who are working with students. And we really need to be tracking and monitoring progress toward those IEP goals.
Right.
Absolutely. And I think at the same time, we also need to be mindful of the fact that we need to be adaptive to the situation. We can't expect to have the same level of intensity given family circumstances in the provision of services, especially in the kinds of supports we will need for parents who are working 2-3 jobs, who don't understand a number of the issues and systems in schools. So we need to think about that. I mean, there is a growing concern with making up for the losses of the last year, and there is a temptation in districts to go full force in terms of covering all of that plus the new content. And that's only going to create greater stress and more frustration on all sides. So I think that the issue of building relationships that we alluded to earlier is critical, that we begin to build trust. I mean, as Susanna mentioned, this pandemic might be an opportunity to create new avenues and new ways of engaging with our colleagues as well as with families.
Absolutely. So I'm turning this back over to Trey, and we're going to be finishing off. I wish we had an hour. I want more time, Trey.
I hear you. So we have a few more of these research to policy discussions scheduled for the rest of this year. Our next one is in late September, and you can find a link to that on cal.org. There will be a follow-up email with that information, including some of the resources that Alfredo and Susanna have mentioned within 24 hours. Also, a recording of this webinar will be available to share with your colleagues if they weren't able to make it today. With that, I will say, what a wonderful conversation. Thank you all so much for being here and taking time out of your busy day. When we first talked, we're jumping from meetings to meetings, as many of you are. So thank you for Zooming in with us. We really appreciate your time and your commitment, specifically for this student population and for this issue area. That's such a big part of the Center for Applied Linguistics. So again, thank you, and look for a follow-up email. Thank you, Dr. Artiles. Thank you, Susanna.
Thank you.
Thank you
all.
for the
Thank
invitation.
you.
Bye-bye.
Take care, colleagues. Bye.
Bye.